Welcome back, everybody, to the Marketing Rules podcast, and it is my pleasure to welcome on board Sam Berthoud. Sam, we've been kind of connected for years, so I know what your kind of background is. But for those who are kind of just joining us for the first time or haven't kind of come across what your great content online, can you give us a bit of a kind of a potted background of your history and what you do now?
Yeah, awesome. And thanks for having me on the show, buddy, after many years being connected and consuming each other's content and bumping into each other. So wonderful to be on. I think in terms of background and what's relevant for this, was at the recruitment events company for many years with Jamie, Bobby, Lois and co. And I think we did about 160, 170 employer brand recruitment marketing, candidate experience events over the years. So yeah, fortunate enough to hear hundreds of great speakers, commentators and industry professionals. Now I'm at hackajob, a VP of Talent Solutions here. And a big part of what we do is, help organizations understand what the tech audience feels about their brand, and work with lots of employer brand leaders to think about how they position themselves and engage with that audience. So that's kind of a little bit of background and what I do. And then I've got my own podcast as well, which we'll have to get you on, soon.
Good stuff. I always like to be on a podcast myself. But what's great is you've kind of got this kind of, this slightly eclectic background, right? That isn't naturally leading you into kind of, the kind of talent attraction and being part of that. You've mentioned around, employer branding and the marketing kind of events you've kind of helped put on. So that's a great place for us to start, I think, around the importance of marketing in the talent acquisition process, because I think it sometimes gets a bit confused with employer branding, and I think there's some kind of stuff around that to unpack. So why don't you kind of kick us off?
And yeah, we could go into depth on the differences and that nuance and where it's lost. And I think, look, what's a great show of why marketing is so important within recruitment is, recruitment marketing tends to be a few years behind mainstream consumer marketing, right? The biggest shifts that we've seen over the last few years have been adopting tools, technologies, practices which are far more akin to consumer marketing. We think about job postings to cost per click to cost per application to now probably cost per qualified interview as people are moving towards, right? So I think a lot of that stuff is borrowed from marketing effectively, and it's almost a way of crystal balling what's coming in recruitment next. It's thinking about retargeting and what that means in the next stage. But it's also about getting that buy-in, right? It's about reaching audiences that you necessarily can't reach through your traditional channels, and you've got to have an omni-channel approach in order to do that. So at a very high level, right, it's what we learn from consumer, what we learn from like sales, B2B, and bring that into recruitment, absolutely central.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. So we talk a lot around the difference between kind of funnels and flywheels and things like that, and trying to kind of move people into kind of a slightly more kind of modern strategic process like the kind of flywheel, as opposed to kind of funnels, which are a bit kind of archaic, right? And so your kind of experience must kind of just be doing exactly the same, right? You've already mentioned this kind of omni-channel approach, that everywhere, all the time, always switched on, giving people that choice where they want to kind of consume that content. Does this align with the kind of what you do and your philosophy and how you kind of, you handle the kind of recruitment marketing?
Yeah, and so I think from like a hackajob perspective, right, we've got a really large catchment, the total addressable audience of tech professionals. And how do we think about engaging with candidates first and foremost? Well, it's not just job posting distribution. It's actually tapping into communities. It's building things like podcasts. It's building newsletters. It's building blog content. It's reaching different pockets of audiences. It's your early careers strategy. And then it's also the experience that you provide, right? When people are then engaging with any types of your content, when you're leading with those marketing efforts, how do you build that like secondary flow? How do you make sure that people are then engaging and feeling really like that close affinity to your brand, that they want to go and tell others, so that they're doing the marketing for you, right? And that's what your brand is, right? What other people are saying about when you're not in the room. And that all stems from like, what are their engagements? Where are they finding that content? And you're seeing that parallel of what we're doing with the way employers are thinking about reaching what is typically a difficult to reach segment and audience, they're mirroring that, right? With
Yeah.
omni-channel, different ways, different means and mediums of content, and then all of the different channels that you can then advertise those through as well, right? It's not just as straight as increasing spend and looking at the drop down and drop down and drop down. There's so much more, to that.
And so, would you consider yourself as a marketeer or a talent acquisition specialist? Are you a bit of both? Is there a difference anymore? Where, what's your kind of view on that?
Yeah, I don't consider myself either. To be fair, there's far better people in the organisation at both of those things. I think if I think about myself, far more of a commentator and absorbing lots of information and able to take a bird's eye view just by the nature of my role. But yeah, I think there's so much grey between those two areas and job titles, because actually think about it from a commercial lens, right? Think about it from like an outbound motion and your overall go to market. Like those messages that reps are sending out on an individual basis are not too dissimilar to an outreach message from a recruiter. And that is marketing. That's one-to-one marketing. That's one-to-one engagement. And that's got to marry up with all of your other parts. And in fact, that secondary message that you might send somebody is probably going to be connecting a dot of relevant content that you're posting to a different channel or a different community that you're part of, or that you've surfaced in another way, right? So, I suppose it's a bit like that adage that everything is sales and everything is marketing in a way, right? Everything you're doing is leading towards that point, and everything you're saying is building towards that message, right?
So, so if anyone kind of coming into the space, right, who's been a recruiter, a recruitment agency, then moving into in-house, it feels like you're kind of saying that now there's this different skill set that they probably need to kind of get on board with, which is a part marketing, part branding kind of skill set and specialism that they probably wouldn't necessarily have to do from just being a recruiter, and that that could be the difference, right?
Well, it's almost like micro influencers, right? If you're after very senior, hard to reach individuals, you want to be leaving them with a lasting experience. You want to be cultivating that audience. You want to be building that talent pipeline over a consistent period of time. And that's part of it. I mean, the most important part, beyond that is actually your business partner, right? Because are you saying the right message? Are you delivering the right message to the right people at the right time? And that's about understanding what the business needs, the business objectives, true business partnering, and then relaying that back, really clearly. And then thinking about the channels that are working for you, right? Optimizing your own output as an individual, and then taking that broader strategic view and thinking, well, how can we optimize the output overall, and how do we make sure we've got the right measurement in place? And I think part of that challenge is, we've been very funnel obsessed, and will continue to be funnel obsessed, would be my guess, over the next period of time, because we're familiar with it. That's where the KPIs are. That's where the performance data is tied to. And we're used to moving people through and thinking about that change. And that's still important. But then, at that top of funnel attraction, it's like all of those other parts all come together to actually make that robust. And when you are reaching out, that's what's changing your response rate. That's what's, changing your output and your perception.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we talk a lot around the kind of the funnel being out of date, because I think it doesn't really now account for, one, the way that candidates search for jobs and how they interact with the brands that they want those jobs with. And a problem potentially with a funnel is it doesn't really allow for going up in the other direction again, right? It's all one way. Whereas a kind of a slightly different kind of thinking about it is that, well, if they might get so far and then it doesn't really work out, and then they kind of just drop out, right? They don't really do much else with them. Whereas another kind of philosophy, this omni-channel philosophy, is like, we continue to keep in contact with them, we continue to keep them in the space. They may never be right for a role, right? It may never be right for a role at but you're completely always keeping them on as an advocate, which we're not going to kind of talk too much about kind of advocacy today. But I guess, as you said, everyone is part of the brand, and that's really what you're trying to kind of cultivate in the end, right?
Yeah, although I think that's like what a nirvana state. The amount of organizations who are sitting there
Brilliant.
on a repository of millions of candidates. It's then like, how much are you keeping that up to date? Is that something which candidates are self populating? And then you've got, platforms like hackajob, which is very up to date with the profiles. You've got things like LinkedIn, where you've got probably a more up to date record than what's internally within your ATS in terms of their current skills and experience. So like, yeah, are you cultivating in the right way? Because in tech in particular, and what we see is, you've got somebody that's got experience with one back end language, and within 18 months they might have experience in a back end language that's only 2 years old. And so they've gone from one of the least experienced candidates in, Java to one of the most experienced in Go. um, all of a sudden the kind of value and the relevancy of that candidate to your organization might change. So I think that kind of cultivation, as much as possible, should be supported as that kind of one-to-one outreach,
Mm.
where the individual as a recruiter has got access to a repository of resources that they can draw upon to make that relevant experience. And then you've got part of that which you'd hope your CRM, would help with cultivating talent over time. But how much are organizations truly using that? There's definitely some out there. I know an org that gets about 70% of their hires from their like previous applicants and like core without moving.
Yeah.
But there's not that many that
Okay.
are at that point.
And that's a really good kind of segue into the other thing we were going to talk about is around kind of community strategy, right? Because this links in completely around building your kind of community or talent pool. It could be the same thing. It might be something slightly different, right? And I'm sure this is kind of exactly what you guys are doing over at kind of Hackajob and kind of what you're kind of doing there. So, yeah, talk us a little bit around that and kind of building those communities.
Yeah, and I think do you know what I was about to say? The A word.
Okay.
I'm going to have to say it just in case somebody thinks it's something else. I was about to say it's about being authentic, right? But I want to move away from that because it's an overused term in kind of marketing, group marketing, brand. But like, if I think about when you are sending out these messages, have you contributed something meaningful to that end community? And that end community could be anything in any talent segment, but let's keep it tech focused. If it's tech focused and you're thinking about, I don't know, attracting more women into tech, like, are you actually actively contributing on an ongoing basis to not-for-profit organizations, to community groups, to things, and actually forwarding and furthering that cause so that you've got something really relevant that is grounded on realism to then take to an audience that you're trying to attract, if that's your goal. If it's something that's more skills based, like a great example would be Scala engineers, right? Scala engineers, there's about 4,000 or so in the UK at that mid to senior level. It's a very small audience, and actually they keep some very critical infrastructure running. Well, you're not going to be able to just reach that audience with ongoing job ads and that kind of traditional methods. So how can you kind of really ingrain yourself with that group? What are those different pockets and parts and meetups and things that you can be a part of and contribute to? And then the other bit which you can contribute to is then that learning piece. It's like, how can you contribute actual real course material, subject matter expertise, bring subject matter in to then, I suppose, further the knowledge within that group. And I think that's where you see a lot of big brands spending their time, is like those channels, whether that's at university level, whether that's at school level, or whether that's further on in people's careers, of like, how can I show this value to people and show that we're not just there to say, hey, come and work for us, this is one-sided. It's a two-way street. And like, ongoing commitment, ongoing like provision of value should then in return bring you that activity and response.
Well, we'll come back to the kind of learning piece because there's a couple of bits we can kind of pick up on there. But this kind of community strategy, again, it's one of these things that I think a lot of kind of people, especially within TA and recruitment, are so wedded to LinkedIn. Right? There's this kind of cult of LinkedIn and expecting that because you're probably paying so much to get access to it, that it's the holy grail, everything is there. And we know that within tech, right, they're probably not there. There's other communities, especially online communities. I mean, you've mentioned the kind of the meetups and stuff, so the face-to-face stuff, which actually is probably easier than actually the online communities because they're probably on where in Reddit or on Substack or somewhere else, right? These days, right? That's kind of these other places. So, you know, the question we get asked a lot, and I'm actually gonna put it to you is how do you even kind of start kind of embedding yourself in those online communities without coming across as a secondhand car salesman, right? Because that's because immediately, right, you're blocked at that point, right? When you kind of start doing that. So, how do you go about that?
Yeah, and also definitely don't dive into Reddit and try and join in, because people remember there, and they'll be very quick to call out and and chastise. So it can be quite difficult, right? I think
Yeah,
it does come back to that dreaded word. It's like, are you contributing something, right? Are you adding to that conversation? Are you adding to the code? Are your engineers part of that, right? So this doesn't need to be a talent focused operation. This is about bringing other stakeholders in your organization in who are already probably part of these communities, right? That is the reality. If you are back end Scala, you are probably going to have people that are part of lots of them. So it goes back to business partnering, right? And understanding, cool, you want me to go and hire for this? I can. But actually, here's all of the things that I'm doing, and here's the bit that you can help me with, right? Whether that's, deriving more subject matter expertise so that you can speak in a more confident or competent way, or whether that's actually tapping in and saying, cool, where do you go? Like, where do you find new information? Are you on Stack Overflow? Are you on GitHub? Like, what communities, what online forums, what meetups, what are you doing? How can we leverage that? How can you be our voice, but without saying, hey, come and work for us all the time,
yeah,
right? And then that's building, again, it's building your content library, right? It's building the ways in which you can reach people. And you'll see increasingly organizations, Lloyd's have got a great tech podcast for their audience, right? Lots of people will have stuff on Medium where their tech professionals are just talking about tech, the projects they're deploying, etc. Obviously, as an org, we're helping people do that, but like lots of people are doing this first party and doing a fantastic job. So I think that's really what it all stems from: is can you get your subject matter experts contributing rather than jumping in and saying, hey, this looks great. And obviously there was a really well trodden one, with one of the big, communities for tech, and then building a talent part of the business, and then that friction between, well, is this a safe space for us to share code, or are we a commodity here? And then that
yeah,
becomes that balance. So, yeah, I think the kind of short answer long. Or the long answer short is, get your subject matter experts in there rather than your talent acquisition people, and then
yeah,
bring people out to your own content where you can have then all of your follow-ons, which are more
yeah.
talent acquisition focused.
You're kind of almost kind of influencer marketing at that point, right? Isn't it? That's kind of what you're kind of it's kind of bordering on that basically. And I guess one of the kind of initial problems, and I guess what we see with these community strategies is one, sometimes the TAs are not, obviously, and you mentioned this, the recruiters just aren't aware that these other spaces kind of, because they haven't asked the questions. And again, maybe on the candidate side, how, from your experience, are the candidates in the kind of in a tech space? I know it's a big generalization, but are they willing to have those conversation with TAs and recruiters? Is that does it come back to the big A word again? Because you've been authentic, then they're happy to have that chat, or is it just kind of that there's this level of distrust, and sometimes it's just kind of it's too difficult to overcome?
I think it's the same as employee generated content across the board. It's that kind of, now, not that this is employee generated content. Maybe this is another EGC, employee generated community, right? Like,
Yeah,
are people bought in enough to the organization as a starting point? Like, do they represent your brand? Do they feel that kind of brand affinity with the company they work for? They're probably more likely to. And like, by and large, I think, the engineering community within the organizations we partner with are really forthcoming in terms of wanting to contribute to content, and wanting to be part of that. And sometimes they're already doing it, but it's not as part of your organization. And it's like, can you then, draw a dotted line, something that's less clear about what that is? And that conversation usually boils down to, well, I don't have time to commit to it, but I would like to.
mm,
So then actually, how can you replay that back? What's the business objective? Well, you don't have time because you don't have the right people in post. These people are really hard to reach. Here's all of the data as to why it's going to be difficult for us because of market size, because of geography, because of whatever other reason. Well, we can help close that gap. if we can build an ongoing community and talent pool and get that affinity and increase our response rates and open up new channels, this is going to help you with that goal, and then playing that back, right? This is then your time saving. It's a bit of time investment now. It's that time invested in return. And then start small. Start with one part of the business, start with one function, whether that's back end, front end, could be sales in another organization, could be marketing. And actually, here's the results of this content. This is why it's reaching people in a better way than what we've been doing already. These are the end outputs. This is what it's meant for this function. Hey, I want to try it with your function now. And making sure you're playing back and trumpeting that information, not just, hey, we've got to the point of the hire. Okay, these are the stage gates along the way. This is all of the things that we're measuring. Thank you for your contributions, and then making sure that's shared across the org as well, right? Not just in silo.
Yeah. Let's kind of circle back to the piece around learning that you touched on earlier as well. So how is there a way that we can kind of lead with learning? And I know prior to this we spoke around MOOCs. So if no one knows what MOOCs, and Sam's going to explain all of these kind of how this kind of works, but you brought it up,
Yeah.
So and you mentioned some of the bigger businesses. It's in their interest to kind of like to have that kind of extracurricular kind of and learning and development as a tool that they can use basically for their own employer branding and their own kind of talent acquisition. So kind of give us a bit of insight into that.
Yeah, and I don't want to make this increasingly tech focused, but I think it's really important to put that lens. Like for us as a brand, we've also got learning modules where people can go in and test their skills and learn new things. But more broadly, like that is what organizations are doing. So if we think about that last segment, we're talking about community. Well, a big part of that is sharing your learnings, right? It's this kind of culture of open source, coding and sharing and development. And unlike many other industries, there isn't like the kind of trappings and costings attached to gaining a new skill. You can learn most of it online. You can learn it for free. And people are kind of happy to tutor each other, whether you work with them or not, or you're paying with them or not. And so I think that's all part of it, right? That's like that micro influencer learning of, hey, I'm sharing what I'm working on and thinking about a problem. Mm-hmm. And then you extrapolate that up and you think about big global organizations, big global tech businesses. Well, they're spending a lot of time with massive online open courses and online learning, where essentially they're providing access to understand how to deploy or code or anything in their languages or on their platforms or on their systems, because ultimately it increases adoption, right? You've got people that are able to do things on the Apple Store. You've got people that are able to do things on Android. You've got Azure, GCP, AWS, right? There's lots of free material provided by these companies, usually partnered with leading universities, to give accreditation to people most of the time for free, because it increases the amount of people using their products or service. And, that's probably the byproduct. The core is you've then got many more people that have that skill that can help other organizations deploy. And, what a great talent pool. You're almost creating the talent pool for everybody, but it also gives you an opportunity for people to have an affinity with, hey, the first cloud platform I learned on was X. Like you're going to feel more familiar with that. And I think from what do tech want? When I think about when we survey our audience and, when candidates are accepting or rejecting positions, it's what's the tech stack that you're working on? What's my ability to learn new skills? What are the skills that I might be able to learn? What's involved with the role, right? What's the size of the data that I'm going to be working with is almost as important as all of the other factors, which is different. I think, probably not different in terms of, I'm sure that is the case across other roles, but in terms of the prominence of the importance, it's a different weighting, I would say, and certainly from reflection on other data sets. And so then it's more important, right, to say, hey, this is what you're going to be writing in, this is what you're going to be learning in, this is what we're moving to, and what you're going to have the opportunity to work with. And all of that ongoing beyond just your marketing outbound and beyond your community work outbound becomes your internal retention, is, your ability to continue to lead with learning, right?
Sam, fascinating stuff, right? I'm sure we can kind of continue this in for hours and hours and hours. And we're sure we will do at some point. We'll have you on for part 2, 3, and 4, like a good Marvel series, right? That we'll keep on going for the next decade. But for now, it has been an absolute pleasure. Obviously, we'll include all of your details in the show notes. If anybody wants to kind of connect with you or know any more about exactly what you're doing or know more about hackajob, then that will all be there. But for now, thank you very much.
Nice one. Thank you.